Hello, welcome to Guildhall Art Gallery. I'm Katherine Pearce, curator of our new exhibition, Inspired, a show which looks at over 300 years' worth of art inspired by literature, theatre and music. All the artworks in this show take their inspiration from another art form and show an interrelation between the textual and the visual. And what emerges are some commonly understood references for the audiences of the time, from whatever century. Mostly these audiences are educated, middle class, particularly in the 19th century, but with the broadening of art galleries and literacy, these paintings and the works they're based on become more accessible. Some of these cultural references, whether a book, a poem, a play or a song, are recognisable to us today, but some of them aren't. And it's interesting to examine which things have lasted through time and which haven't. Indeed, the same goes for cultural figures, maybe actors, musicians, writers, many of which we revere today and some of whom we don't. And at the heart of this exhibition is a question. Which things in our own culture, and indeed which cultural figures, will endure? Which ones will be remembered in 200 years' time, say, and which won't? What will be lost and what will last? The range of poetic influences in art is enormous, but one particular poet stands out in this collection anyway, and that is John Keats. The poetry of John Keats is still read and taught today, but arguably he may not have had such an enduring influence if his work hadn't been visualised by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Keats's own inspirations were Milton and, of course, Shakespeare, but also medieval stories that he translated into his own romantic poetry. The Pre-Raphaelites, a group of young up-and-coming artists in the 1840s, shared Keats's vision of a medieval inspiration. And indeed, they saw Keats as one of the greats, an under-acknowledged and fantastic poet who had not had the kind of reception that, say, Lord Byron had had. Keats's impact in his own lifetime was limited, partly due to the fact that he did not live very long. He died at the age of 25 in 1821. This painting on my left is by Keats's friend Joseph Severn, who travelled with him to Rome while he was dying of tuberculosis and was with him in his final days. Severn was extremely affected by this and continued to sketch Keats throughout his career. This painting imagines Keats on Hampstead Heath listening to the nightingale which inspired his Ode to a Nightingale. Keats's poem The Eve of St Agnes was published in 1820, and in 1847 a young artist called William Holman Hunt read it and decided to create a painting for a Royal Academy show the following year. This is it on my left. The depiction of a poetic subject, and a medieval one at that, rendered it very unusual, and it stood out to another artist who was at that particular exhibition, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti introduced himself to Holman Hunt and through him also met John Everett Millais, a fellow student of the Royal Academy who had actually helped Holman Hunt finish this painting on time. He's responsible for these figures in the back, in the arches there. The three of them began talking and realised they shared the same kinds of values about what they wanted to do with British art, make it fresh, make it new, make it much more exciting, and they formed the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It's partly due to the Pre-Raphaelites' interest in Keats that his work was brought back to public consciousness through visual imagery and his reputation was secured. All the paintings around me were painted in the 19th century, a high point for interest in poetic inspiration. Sometimes the poetic inspirations were more well established in the literary canon, such as in William Dyce's painting of George Herbert, a 17th century metaphysical and devotional poet. This painting imagines the poet composing in his garden, where the artist was actually staying at the time that he made this painting, and it was displayed with lines from Virtue, a reflection of Herbert's faith and musing on his own mortality. Sometimes the poetic inspirations were more contemporary and indeed contemporaneous to the artist. This is The Woodman's Daughter by Millais, and it's based on a poem by his friend, Coventry Patmore, of the same title. And there's only a matter of years between the poem's publication and the painting. Originally, this painting was displayed with 2 whole stanzas of text from that poem, which seems like a great way of doing favours for a friend. And while this may have been helpful for Patmore's career then, he's not generally read now. And in a different way, John Byam Liston Shaw acknowledges a debt in the inspiration of this painting, The Blessed Damozel. It's based on a poem by Rossetti, and an excerpt of the poem is actually displayed in the painting in this bottom right-hand corner. What's slightly unusual about this piece is that it was painted in 1895, so at the very latter end of the Pre-Raphaelite movement when aestheticism had sort of taken over as the predominant visual style. But in depicting a subject based on a Rossetti poem from 1850, Liston Shaw is acknowledging a kind of artistic debt, and this painting is almost a tribute to Rossetti himself, both in its style and its inspiration. The musical inspirations in this section range from generic depictions of how music makes us feel, how it inspires us as people, and specific portraits of influential composers and musicians. And here we can also look at cultural references which may have been lost to time and may no longer be commonly understood. For example, the opera Mignon. And this is Mignon, the heroine of that opera. And she's a young girl who's been captured by a travelling circus. In the original Goethe story, the ending is very tragic and it's all about unrequited love for the man who rescues her. In the French version, the comic opera version, they of course changed the ending to be happier, more cheerful and pleasant. And this went down quite well with audiences, and as you can see, this sculptural depiction references what must have been a very popular and well-known story. However, although this went down well with audiences in Paris, when they opened the opera in Berlin, the audience did not like the comic ending and demanded it be hastily rewritten back to Goethe's original tragic end. Another subject who may be slightly lost to time outside of specialist circles is the violinist, conductor and composer Joseph Joachim. He was Hungarian and made an international career travelling around Europe. He was also a close collaborator of Brahms, and his life intersected with Mendelssohn, Clara Schumann, amongst others. He was best known for his performance of Beethoven concertos, and he was a hugely influential figure in his day. Although perhaps no longer a household name, his legacy lives on because he was a teacher who taught many of the great virtuoso violinists from the 19th and into the 20th century. You can also still hear some of his recordings that were made at the very end of his life. This once famous violinist is depicted in more than one artwork in this exhibition. Jumping forward into the 20th century, Anthony Pilbrow's The Singer gives us a more impressionistic idea of what it feels like to be a singer or performer. The picture captures the vulnerability and rawness necessary to public performance. With these kind of stressful colours and movement, the open mouth posture, almost like a silent scream, gives us a sense of the openness and fragility of the individual performer when they are giving something to an audience. The singer is staring out at us, but this also reads as a slightly stressful and painful experience. Think of the last time you saw a piece of art, a modern art, perhaps a painting, that was based on a book you'd already read, but a modern book. It's actually quite hard to do because outside of fan art or illustration, there aren't a huge number of contemporary artists working with literary materials of their own time. While some contemporary artists work with mythology or folklore or even specific text in their work, the art of depicting scenes from novels is actually something of a lost genre. But one such artist who did in the Victorian period, which was absolutely the high point for these kinds of works, was Sir John Gilbert. And as well as being prolific, John Gilbert was also multi-skilled in different artistic disciplines: oil, watercolour, illustration, woodcut engraving, and he particularly produced illustrations and engravings for popular press and for publications of novels: Shakespeare, Walter Scott, all the Romantics and contemporary Victorian novelists. And because of the breadth and multiplicity of his inspirations, we gain an insight into some of the popular literature of the 19th century. These two pictures here, they're watercolours on paper, although they are incredibly detailed, so they may not seem like it at first glance. They are based on a French picaresque novel of the 18th century called Gil Blas. Now, a picaresque novel is one that takes a low-born hero and follows his adventures across the whole breadth of society, and he meets people high and low across the entire social spectrum and eventually ends up in a better position than when he started. Now, this is a popular form of early novel, which arguably Dickens perfected in the Victorian period with David Copperfield and Great Expectations, but Gil Blas is a sort of prototype for those kinds of novels, and John Gilbert here gives us two scenes from those books. One literary source that really has stood the test of time is Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, published in the early 17th century and depicted here in Sir John Gilbert's watercolour of the mid-19th century. Don Quixote is a knight, or at least he thinks he is. He's an eccentric man who wants to have adventures and live up to chivalric ideals and treats the world around him as if it's one big courtly story. And he is supported in this endeavour, somewhat cynically, by Sancho Panza, his faithful sidekick. And Quixote believes that he is his squire, and actually Sancho Panza is just a simple man attempting to get by and support Quixote and see that he comes to no harm. And although the two go on fantastic adventures in a sort of fictional landscape of his own making, they learn real things about themselves along the way. And in particular, Sancho Panza comes to the realisation that he can live up to the high ideals that Quixote has taught him. And here you see them in a wilderness, essentially, an empty landscape, which will be populated entirely by Quixote's imagination and by his suggestions. And we as viewers are invited to sort of enter into this delusion, but to also see the sort of fictive potential of the landscape space. The largest section in this exhibition is on theatre and theatricals. These works celebrate theatrical culture and the famous actors and actresses of their day. The Guildhall Art Gallery collection reflects a taste for drama and narrative, and of course the enduring influence of Shakespeare, whose universality of emotion and themes of power, loss, love and identity translate into painting extremely effectively. These paintings and sculptures engage with plays as live experiences, not merely as words on a page. Although often displayed with relevant passages of text, as we've seen in the poetry section, the primary function of theatrical painting relates to the function of theatre itself, to be seen and not read. This fantastically charismatic sculpture by Edward Onslow Ford depicts Sir Henry Irving as Hamlet in what became known as a famous Hamlet chair. Irving played Hamlet over 200 times, and he was one of the leading actor-managers of the mid to late 19th century. Now, he may seem slightly older than we might expect the Prince of Denmark to be, and although it is written on his plinth who he's supposed to be, and the point of this sculpture, I think, is to memorialise the actor in his favourite role, the one he was best known to the public for, rather than to depict the character. And as such, the inspiration here is Irving himself, rather than Hamlet, but we have layers of inspiration: Shakespeare, the character, the actor-manager, and the sculptor. This is a 1948 portrait by Sir Matthew Smith of the actress Valerie Hobson. Valerie Hobson was an Irish-born actress, and she appeared in many British films between the 1930s and the 1950s, most notably Bride of Frankenstein, Great Expectations, and Kind Hearts and Coronets. Smith himself was surrounded by a circle of artists and creatives, actors, writers, all sorts of people who would model for his work, and he was highly in demand for portraits. Valerie Hobson was a leading light of her day, but in the later 60s she became known for something quite different. She's otherwise known as Mrs. John Profumo. When her husband was caught up in the Christine Keeler sex scandal in the 1960s, it was epoch-changing. It changed the way journalists and politicians interacted. It changed the public's perception of politicians. And although Hobson had retired from her professional career when she married Profumo, she became inextricably linked with that scandal. But this depiction shows her in her heyday, in her own right, as a figure of inspiration. Now, you may or may not recognise our next actor. This is Terry Thomas. Although depicted without his trademark cad grin with the gap tooth in the middle, he's best known for Ealing comedies and for his upper-class caddish persona, always disreputable and very dodgy, but also very funny. This sculpture is very humble, and it's because the artist knew Terry Thomas in a personal capacity and saw beyond the stage persona. The artist Ronald Moody was a Jamaican sculptor, and his wife Helen was Terry Thomas's PA for decades. So of course he had a huge amount of opportunity to observe him, talk to him in a personal, friendly capacity. And so in deliberately concealing this gap-toothed caddish persona and giving us a quiet, peaceful, thoughtful figure, he really is marking the difference between the public persona and the private life. This monumental canvas is by Daniel Maclise. It was painted in 1840, and it depicts Act 3, Scene 4 of Macbeth. And in it, Banquo's ghost is appearing at the feast, but only Macbeth can see him. Now, at first glance, your eyes are immediately drawn, I think, to Lady Macbeth, who is desperately trying to control the crowd of assembled Scottish gentry in this gloomy castle. And we see that Macbeth's eyeline is elsewhere. And what you may miss on first glance is this terrifying shadowy figure in the chair, the ghost of Banquo, who Macbeth has had killed. And you get a suggestion of what a sort of ghoulish figure he might appear in the kind of ragged edges of his hair, and also in the fact that he is grey with terror. And when you look around the castle, you get a real sense of all the different expressions on the faces, the different reactions, people peering with flaming brands, trying to work out what on earth is there. What Maclise has done here, using this space and using this kind of setup, is to put you in a theatre seat. It's almost like looking at a proscenium arch. So you're front and centre, getting Shakespeare's drama firsthand.